Your brain will not let go of an unfinished task, not until you close it. This is the Zeigarnik effect, and it explains why one open Slack thread can wreck your entire afternoon. Psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik first noticed the pattern in a Vienna cafe in the 1920s. She watched waiters work the floor, carrying dozens of orders in their heads at once. Ask a waiter about an unpaid table, and he could recite it instantly, item by item, no notepad required. But the moment the bill was paid, that same memory vanished. Almost immediately, the waiter would look at you blankly if you asked about a table that had already settled up an hour earlier. Zeigarnik found that strange enough to take back into the lab. She ran controlled experiments to test what she'd seen on the cafe floor. Give people a set of small tasks, simple puzzles, basic assembly work, short arithmetic problems. Let some of them finish every task without interruption. Interrupt the others partway through before they can complete the work. Then ask everyone, later, to recall what they'd been doing. The interrupted group remembered far more, not slightly more. Far more. People given interrupted tasks recalled them far better than tasks they finished. Something about incompletion kept the material alive in memory, while completion let it fade almost immediately. Psychologists now call this the Zeigarnik effect, and it has held up across nearly a century of follow-up research since. Here is the mechanism, as best anyone understands it. Your mind treats an unfinished task like an open file. It stays loaded, using a small but constant slice of your attention, because some part of your brain is still tracking that the job is not done. Finish the task, and the brain gets to close the file. Attention gets released. Nothing left to track. It is less like a to-do list and more like background programs running quietly on a computer you forgot were open. Each one alone barely costs anything. String together 6 or 7 of them though, and your whole system starts to lag. That is why a half-written email nags you at 2 a.m. long after you told yourself you would deal with it tomorrow. Your brain does not know the difference between choosing not to finish something yet and something being genuinely urgent. It just knows the file is open. Same story with one open Slack thread. Objectively, it might be the least important thing on your plate all day, but because it is an open loop, it can hijack focus completely out of proportion to its actual size. You sit down to do real, meaningful work, and some fraction of your attention keeps drifting back, checking whether that thread has quietly resolved itself. Now scale that up to a team. Managers see this constantly without ever naming it. A project paused mid-sprint keeps draining attention, even when nobody is actively working on it. Maybe it is waiting on a decision from someone 2 levels up. Nobody touches it for a week. And yet it keeps pulling focus from the people who were assigned to it because the loop never got a proper close. It is not sitting quietly on a shelf in anyone's mind. It is sitting there, humming, low level, pulling a little bit of bandwidth from everything else those people try to concentrate on. It shows up in places managers rarely connect back to this effect. A performance review that ends with vague feedback and no concrete follow-up leaves the employee replaying the conversation for days, trying to reconstruct what was actually being asked of them. An onboarding process that stalls halfway, with a new hire waiting on system access, or a manager introduction that never quite happens, leaves that person mentally circling the gap instead of settling into the job. A cross-department handoff where nobody explicitly confirmed receipt keeps both sides quietly wondering whether the ball is still in their court. None of these look like the same problem on the surface. A performance review has nothing to do with a system access ticket, but underneath, they are identical. Each one is an open loop with no landing spot, and each one is quietly taxing someone's attention until it gets closed, whether that closure comes from finishing the work or simply writing down where things stand. Meetings do the same thing, and this is the one that costs the most without anyone noticing it happen. Meetings that end without clear next steps leave everyone mentally stuck for hours afterward. Everyone nods, everyone leaves, and on the surface, the meeting looks finished. But mentally, for the people who were in the room, it is not finished at all. There is now an unresolved thread sitting in each of their heads. What exactly happens next, and whose job is it? That thread does not stay contained to meeting-related work. It bleeds sideways into unrelated tasks for the rest of the day. Someone tries to focus on a document an hour later, and their mind keeps flicking back to the meeting, half-consciously trying to resolve what was left open. Employees carry that tension into unrelated work, and overall focus quietly suffers, day after day, meeting after meeting, in a way that never shows up on any performance dashboard, because there is no single moment you could point to and say that is exactly where the hour disappeared. Here is the analogy that tends to make this click. Think of your attention like the RAM on a computer, not like a hard drive. A hard drive can store an enormous amount of information indefinitely, at essentially zero ongoing cost, as long as nothing is actively running. RAM works differently. Anything currently open in RAM costs you performance right now, whether or not you are actively using it in that moment. An unfinished task does not get filed away neatly on your mental hard drive. It stays loaded in RAM. And RAM is exactly the resource a manager is competing for every time they ask someone to sit down and think hard about an ambiguous problem. Here is what makes this genuinely strange, if you sit with it for a second. The size of the task has almost nothing to do with how loud the loop is in your head. A 5-minute email you have not sent can occupy the same mental real estate as a genuinely large, unresolved decision. Your brain is not weighting these loops by importance, it is weighting them by openness. That is a strange design choice for something as sophisticated as the human mind, and it is exactly the kind of mismatch that makes the Zeigarnik effect worth understanding on purpose rather than just suffering through by accident. Most people assume their scattered focus on a busy day is about having too much to do. Often, it is not. It is about having too many things left dangling with no clear next step, regardless of how big or small each one actually is. So, what actually closes the loop? This is where it gets genuinely useful and slightly counterintuitive. You would assume the only way to quiet the Zeigarnik effect is to finish the task outright. Do the work, close the loop, done. But that is not quite what the research shows. And it is definitely not practical advice for a manager running a real team, where dozens of things are legitimately unfinished at any given moment. The fix is not finishing everything before you stop. It is closing the loop on paper, even when the task itself is not done. Follow-up studies on the effect found something almost too convenient to be true. Writing down a plan for resuming a task produces close to the same relief as finishing it outright. Your brain does not actually need the work completed. It needs confidence that the work has been captured somewhere reliable, with a plan attached, so it no longer has to keep holding the thread itself. A written note like "paused here, resume Monday" satisfies the brain enough to let go for the weekend. That is the whole trick. A handful of words on a sticky note or inside a project tracker, and the open loop stops actively pulling at your attention, because your brain has effectively outsourced the job of remembering to something it trusts. This is exactly why some companies now test this on purpose, deliberately building the habit into how teams operate, rather than leaving it to individual willpower. Software teams that require ending each sprint with explicit written closure report sharper focus the following week. Not because more work got done in that sprint. Total output is not necessarily higher. It is because fewer loops stayed open in people's heads once the sprint ended, which means Monday morning starts clean instead of starting with a dozen half-remembered dangling threads left over from 2 weeks earlier. But here is the part that catches most managers off guard once they actually sit with it. You would think the priority should be protecting more time for people to finish tasks completely, so fewer things stay open in the first place. That is the obvious intervention, and most companies chase exactly that one. The research points somewhere far more manageable instead. You do not need to reduce how much stays unfinished. You need to reduce how much stays unfinished without a written landing spot. Those are very different problems to solve. Finishing more work requires more hours, more headcount, more capacity, things a manager frequently does not control. Writing down where something stands and what happens next costs almost nothing and takes maybe 90 seconds per item. It is one of the rare psychological interventions that is nearly free and still measurably effective, which is precisely why it is worth building into a team's habits, rather than treating it as a nice-to-have. The same logic extends well past meetings, once you start looking for it. One-on-ones are a classic source of quiet open loops. A manager and an employee talk through a problem for 30 minutes, land on something close to an agreement, and then the conversation just ends because time ran out. Nobody wrote down what was agreed. A week later, neither person is entirely sure whether the other one is acting on it. That ambiguity is not a trust problem, and it is not a communication problem in the usual sense. It is an unclosed loop, and it will keep costing both people attention until someone writes the one sentence that should have ended the conversation in the first place. Here is what we agreed. Here is who does what. Here is when we check back in. Status updates work the same way. A weekly update that just lists what happened does very little for this problem because it describes the past. A weekly update that also states, plainly, what is currently paused and what its next trigger is does a lot for this problem because it gives every open item in the business a landing spot that other people can see. That visibility matters almost as much as the writing itself. An open loop that only exists in one person's head has to be actively held by that one person. An open loop that is written down somewhere shared can be mentally set down by everyone who would otherwise be tracking it privately, because the group now trusts the document to remember instead of each individual having to. Think about what this means for how you personally run a single day, not just how you run a team. Every open browser tab, every unanswered message sitting in your inbox, every half-drafted document is a small tax on your concentration, whether or not you are consciously thinking about it right now. You do not need to close all of them by finishing the underlying work. You need each one to have a landing spot. One line that says where it stands and what the next move is. Do that, and the tab can stay open on your screen indefinitely without costing you anything mentally, because your brain has already filed it as handled. This is also, worth saying plainly, one of the more useful psychological findings for anyone managing people, precisely because it does not require you to change how much work exists. It requires you to change how work gets left. Most teams already generate more open loops in a week than any single person could realistically close. That is not a failure of time management. That is simply what real work looks like at any reasonable scale. The lever is not closing every loop. It is making closure cheap and habitual, so that even the loops that stay genuinely open stop costing full attention while they wait. It is worth noticing that other industries have been exploiting this effect for a long time, just aimed in the opposite direction. Television writers deliberately end episodes mid-scene, right before a resolution, because they know an open loop is what actually gets someone to hit play on the next episode, instead of closing the laptop. Advertisers use unresolved questions in headlines for exactly the same reason. The entire cliffhanger, as a storytelling device, is nothing more than the Zeigarnik effect used on purpose. A manager is not trying to make anyone binge-watch their own job, obviously. But it is a useful reminder that this pull is not some minor psychological footnote. It is strong enough to be the entire business model of industries built around holding attention. If it is strong enough to keep millions of people awake past midnight finishing a show, it is easily strong enough to quietly wreck a Tuesday afternoon at the office. Try this the next time you run a meeting. End it with one written line per open item, stating exactly what happens next and who owns it. Not a full action plan, not a formal document nobody will reread. Just one sentence per unresolved thread, visible to everyone in the room before they leave. That small habit closes the mental loop before people even leave the room, and it costs nothing to start tomorrow. No budget, no new software, no extra headcount required. Just a habit, repeated meeting after meeting, until it becomes the default instead of the exception everyone forgets. There is a temptation, once you learn this, to try to eliminate open loops entirely. Resist it. That instinct usually backfires, because it pushes people toward rushing tasks to false completion just to make the mental noise stop, which trades a real problem, a lingering open loop, for a worse one, work that was closed too early and has to be reopened later anyway. The goal was never zero open loops. Any team doing meaningful work will always have things in progress, waiting, blocked, or paused for good reasons. The goal is that every one of those open loops has a clear, written, trusted answer to two questions. Where does this stand, and what happens next? Answer those two questions in writing, and the loop stops behaving like an emergency in someone's head, even while it is still, quite legitimately, unfinished. And here is the honest reason this matters more than it sounds like it should. Attention is the actual scarce resource in almost every modern workplace, far more scarce than time on a calendar. You can schedule 8 hours for someone and still get 2 real hours of thinking out of them if the other 6 are quietly occupied holding open loops that were never given anywhere to land. Fix the loops, and you get the attention back, without adding a single extra hour to anyone's day. So the next time a project stalls or a meeting ends without a clear next step, remember what was happening in that Vienna cafe 100 years ago. The waiters were not remarkable for their memory. They were remarkable for how completely they forgot the instant a table's bill was settled. That is the real skill worth building into a team, not carrying every open thread in your head indefinitely, but knowing exactly how to close one. On paper, fast enough that your brain believes it, and finally, let's go. What's the open loop nagging at you right now? Drop it in the comments below.